I think there's a sufficiency of us back for us to begin the 11 o'clock session at 12:05. So hopefully we'll get through something by round about 1 o'clock. Before I start, can I ask, the organisers have asked me to ask the chairpersons of the afternoon breakaway sessions at the end of this session, would they please gather over there to my left, where the organisers would like them all to come and have a kind of a chat over lunch together. So the chairpersons of the afternoon breakaway sessions, please. Now, my name is Rodney Rice. I'm a retired former broadcaster in RTE, the National Broadcasting Service here in Ireland, and I worked and covered politics at home, but I also spent about 30 years travelling the developing world, looking at issues, a broad range of issues there. So I'm also, apart from that, I've become more recently a board member of ActionAid Ireland and ActionAid International, of which ActionAid Ireland is obviously an affiliate, a federal member, is going to start a campaign on safe cities next year. So I thought, well, when I was asked to speak here, or to chair this rather, I thought, well, you know, it's absolutely sort of in the right territory for me, except that I've been asked to chair a session about technology. And I'm afraid I'm rather something of a Luddite when it comes to technology. For those of you who don't come from these islands, the Luddites were British textile workers in the 19th century who objected to the introduction of new machinery in textile making because it was a threat to their jobs. As a former print and then for most of my career broadcast journalist, I still believe that the press, the radio, the television are the legacy media, as some people call them, as if they were dead, are still the key ways in which people communicate, and that they need to bring them together in this world. But, however, I have to recognize, I do recognize that even though I can't quite work the latest smartphone that I've got too well, that there are people around the world in developed and developing nations who are using smart technology, sometimes for good, like in the Arab Spring, sometimes for ill, like in organising the Tottenham riots in Britain and the Northern Ireland Loyalist riots up the road from us here. But as a development journalist, I have come to recognise the use of and importance of the smartphone for microfinance, for other banking issues, and for price knowledge in the developing world. I learned last year in Senegal at a conference that there are now 650 million telephones, mobile phones in Africa, 275 million of which are smartphones. And they're vital for rural people with no access to newspapers or TV, although 80% of people in most of Africa still get their main news from radio. But they're important for, as I say, for all those financial reasons. And I understand that M-Pesa, which is a money transfer system, has more than 17 million customers in sub-Saharan Africa at this stage. Now, you know that in Bangladesh, Muhammad Yunus set up telephone companies. He got involved in microfinancing and set up telephone companies to try to help that, the use of technology. One of those companies was the Village Phone Project, where women borrowers could take a loan to buy a handset and solar-powered charger and function as their village payphone, providing the women with a substantially increased income. And when talking to the newspaper The Citizen, Muhammad Yunus said, if a poor woman gets hold of one mobile phone in the village, then that's a sure bet that her entire family can move out of poverty in 2 or 3 years. So technology and poverty clearly are going to be together, hopefully in a positive way. But there are still problems which can be found. Evidence, I think, is seen by some as inconclusive about whether technology transfer contributes to growth and to poverty reduction. In knowing that everyone here at this conference was going to be speaking positively, I thought, particularly as a journalist who usually looks at negative things, I suppose, at least that's what people say about us, that I should look and find what the criticisms of technology are. And I read in the Boston Review that ICT for development enthusiasts don't design context-appropriate technology which adhere to socio-cultural norms, don't account for poor electricity supply, don't build relationships with local governments, don't invite the participation of the community, don't provide services that meet local needs, don't consider bad transportation infrastructure, don't think through a viable financial model, and don't provide incentives for all stakeholders. That is very negative, and I'm sure that a lot of people here and hopefully on the platform are going to disagree with that, but we'll see. However, the main message for that is that until and unless the technology is applied where human intent and capacity are already present, or unless you're willing to invest heavily in developing human capacity and institutions, there will be problems. So will those limitations find echoes amongst this panel that we have assembled before us today? Let's meet them. They're Dr. Jo Beall from the British Council, Carl Wright from the British Commonwealth Local Government Forum, Tong Teng Fei, that's a change from the programme you have in front of us, from the People's Government of Beijing Municipality, and Vinay Venkatraman of the Copenhagen Institute of Interaction Design, of which we'll hear later. Because to set the context for us, first of all, I'm going to ask Dr. Jo Beall to join us. She's Director of Education and Society at the British Council, a former professor in the Development Studies Institute at LSE, the London School of Economics. Her research work has taken her around the world studying social development, local governments, safer cities, and gender. Dr. Jo Beall.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to be here. I'm absolutely delighted to be addressing an audience that is interested in and concerned about issues that are dear to my heart. I know that you probably want to get into the meat of the discussion and particularly the focus on technology and smart cities, but I'm going to spend a bit more time putting technology in context. Some of what I have to say has been said by some of the other speakers, so I'm going to whip through some of the early slides and get to the meat in a moment. But I think the most important thing to recognize about urbanization when we're looking at it in a global context is that up until some people say a date in May 2009, the world was predominantly rural. And after that date, people who model these things said the tipping point had been reached and more people on the globe were living in urban centers than in rural areas. Now, it wasn't a peasant walking down the road and entering a town that led to this. It was a symbolic moment, but a very important one, particularly for the majority world, which has always been thought of as a world that is predominantly beset by rural problems. I was really very heartened to hear that ActionAid Ireland is taking up safer cities. In the 90s, I was a Board of Trustees member of ActionAid UK and spent a lot of time trying to encourage ActionAid to take on the issue of urban poverty. It's taken a long time, but I think it's worth it as more and more people are recognizing what we as urbanists have known for a long time, which is that the majority of the world lives in cities, and indeed the majority of the poor increasingly are living in cities. Looking at things globally, we're not looking at countries or regions starting from the same base point. Urbanization growth rates differ across regions and indeed off different bases. So Europe, Latin America, North America, very much more urbanized to start off with. The most rapidly urbanizing areas, though, are now in the majority world. Africa off the lowest base, but urbanizing most rapidly, followed by Asia, Latin America, and so on. And as I say, urban poverty is increasing. And there are many ways in which you can measure urban poverty. There are many indicators, but a very stark indicator is the prevalence of slums. And if you look at the slum population by region, you see just how many people are living in inadequate housing and neighborhoods, and particularly in Asia and Africa. What do we know about urban poverty? Well, until recently, it was seen as a predominantly rural problem outside of North America and Europe. And that gave rise to what was called the urban bias thesis, put forward by Michael Lipton in the 1970s. And he argued that development and newly independent governments in continents like Africa and Asia were putting too much emphasis on cities, were investing too much in cities, and this was at the expense of the rural poor. And for many years, the development industry and development actors and practitioners and scholars followed the idea, and for many years quite correctly, that interventions needed to be made in rural areas. But what happened was that what was predicted to be the case in the 1950s and 60s, that urban growth and economic growth would go together, that increasing urban populations would lead to more people being employed, higher levels of consumption, greater demand, greater production, more economic growth. That didn't quite happen in the way that was predicted. And so what you had was urbanization plus growth, but not necessarily the reduction of poverty. Instead, you had burgeoning slums, increasing numbers of people working in the informal economy, and the kinds of cities that we see around the world today had their birth. In the 1980s, there was a lot of focus on urban poverty. This was very much tied up with people who were being critical of the economic reform measures that countries had to undertake and go through in the wake of the 1970s oil crisis. And what those economic reform measures did was put key focus on the export of commodities and food crops. And that turned the terms of trade away from cities and towards rural areas. Well, it did some good for national economies and some good for rural production, but it had a lot of unintended knock-on consequences for cities, and particularly for poor and disadvantaged people in cities, who, in addition to seeing the terms of trade move against the cities, were subject to cuts in subsidies, a reduction in employment opportunities and wages, and so on. By the time we get to the 2000s, it was a problem that was impossible to deny. And work done by Martin Ravallion and his team at the World Bank in 2007 showed very conclusively, for the first time, that rates of poverty were increasing more rapidly in cities than in rural areas. So what his study showed is that the poor have been urbanizing more rapidly than the population as a whole. And based on the count of $1 a day between 1993 and 2002, they estimated that the poor fell by 150 million in rural areas, but rose by 50 million in urban areas. So what that showed was urbanization fosters economic growth and reduces overall poverty, and we've seen that in the way the MDGs have hit some of the poverty targets, but urban poverty has not been included in that happy story. So what are the key characteristics of urban poverty? The density of cities means that planning is key. And we've heard a lot about planning already this morning. But planners and urban governments can't always keep up, can't always keep pace with the demands, the pace of urban growth and urban population growth. And yet people who live in cities, city dwellers, get on with life, do things for themselves. And that means that the key characteristic of city life is informality. The livelihoods that people make in the informal economy are informal. 7 out of 10 people in African cities make their money in the unregulated, informal economy. Housing is informal. The structure you see in the picture there, a slum in Bangalore. I, as a very young researcher, was doing a sample survey, plotting out the number of informal structures so I could do my interviews. Came back the next day to start them once I'd plotted out my survey, and that settlement had burnt down. So structures are informal. The tenure that people have is informal. Even if they have a shack, have a community, have a family life, it's still very vulnerable. And of course, in these settlements and in the cities of the countries in which I've worked, often governance is informal, and I'll come back to that issue. If we look at the whole world of work, the first thing that we have to notice in cities that differentiates urban poverty from rural poverty is that it's an entirely monetized economy. There's no falling back on subsistence agriculture. There's no borrowing from your neighbor because your neighbor's equally poor as you and is also unemployed. So that makes urban poverty particularly punitive. Urban poverty is not always in city centres. It's often in peripheral areas. So the pictures you see are of an informal settlement on the outskirts of Mazar-e-Sharif in Afghanistan, where I did some of my research. And it's a long journey into town, but there's by no manner of means could you call that community a rural community. It's a dust bowl on the edge, on the peripheral edge of a city. And the third thing to say about the world of work is that the poorest people generally work in the informal economy, not owning businesses, but working for businesses in the most exploited positions, often women, often unregulated, poorly paid, or in similarly unregulated ways as casual laborers. If we look at the environments that people live in, the picture you see is of an inner city slum in Karachi. In that area, there was piped water, but it only flowed 1 or 2 hours a day. And then the taps had to run for hours on end before anything like drinkable or usable water came out of them. As we've heard from other speakers today, people in these areas face health threats, environmental hazards, lack of public safety, road traffic accidents, huge problem for the urban poor. The kind of smoke inhalation health problems and gastrointestinal health problems that Mary Robinson was talking about. And of course, for women, the threat always hanging over them of interpersonal violence. If not in the family, then in the neighborhood. If not in the neighborhood, then sometimes from the authorities. So what are the social dimensions of urban poverty? Rural areas are often seen to be characterized by social networks, mutuality, reciprocity, people working together, clinging together, helping each other in in their rural communities. And it's often said that when people move to cities, that those social bonds are broken. And it certainly is more difficult in city contexts to maintain the same kind of social bonds, but new ones are formed. So I think we mustn't fall into the trap of thinking the urban poor are atomized, fragmented, and not connected. They are, but in different ways and with much greater difficulty. And there are certain groups within the urban poor who are more fragmented and atomized and isolated and excluded than others. If you are a woman-headed household or in a woman-maintained family, which is the term I prefer because so many women are in families, but they are the only ones who are breadwinners as domestic workers or as casual laborers, there's not much time for working on cultivating and nurturing the social bonds that allow you to ask your neighbor for help and to give and offer help in return. These low-income communities are often victim of slumlords or urban mafias, and these are some of the more pernicious informal urban governance structures that operate, that replace the role of the state when the state is unwilling or unable to extend services and even exercise a presence in poor areas. So I think we've done the diagnosis. I think we know what is to be done and why. Responding to informal urbanization is the key issue. And I think technology, and here I am beginning to get to the point, technology is very important in helping us understand and respond to the key issues of durable shelter. It's technology that's going to come up with the low-cost solutions, improving basic services. We know that technology has already come up with important ways of addressing sanitation crises, water access, and so on. I think we also know that cities are ideal places to address these issues and these problems. We know that cities are dense. We know that they are diverse, and we know that they're dynamic. And those 3 Ds are very important in what economists have called the agglomeration effects of cities. When a lot of people who are very different come together, you've got diverse labor markets to choose from. You've got diverse markets for goods and inputs. You have the situation for the creation of technology and innovation. Jane Jacobs, the great urbanist, spoke about cities as dynamic centers and sites for innovation. So those are all the good things that can come from cities. We also know that there are efficiencies in delivering services and welfare in concentrated settlements as opposed to people who are dispersed over wide geographies. Sure. So I think what I would say as we look at the negative and the positive outcomes of agglomeration, that in looking at governance, which is where, of course, I think it all stems back to, we need to bear in mind a number of things. And the one issue is policy for cities can't be left to cities alone, and that's been stressed by other speakers. National urban policy is critical. I think the other critical thing is to escape from the apathy that often exists in urban populations because for so long they haven't had any response from their leaders, but also to respond to the energy and resilience and ingenuity of urban dwellers. And as we develop our technology, to do so with them, not against them, or even for them. These two pictures, I think, say it all for me. The one is a disabled man in a wheelchair in Herat in Afghanistan, hitching a ride on the back of a horse-drawn cart in the city. The other is of informal sector traders in Johannesburg selling their goods illegally under a sign that says, "No informal traders here." And I think the message is, if we see these people as illegal, if we see them as problems, we're not going to harness the energy, the innovation, and the contribution that they can make to smart, safe, and sustainable cities. Thank you.